Hello. Today I'll be discussing Dr. Eric Green's Healing Breaths and Rotting Bones on the relationship between Buddhist and Chinese meditation practices during the Eastern Han and Three Kingdoms period. Let's get started. Dr. Green is Berkeley educated with graduate degrees in East Asian Studies and Buddhist Studies. He knows classical Chinese and specializes in the following: medieval Chinese Buddhism and the transmission of Buddhism to China, Chinese translation of Indian Buddhist literature, and finally, Buddhist meditation. All this establishes him as an eminently qualified and reliable source for the topic under consideration. Green's main argument is that the relationship between Buddhist meditation and native Chinese meditative practices is more complicated than scholars previously believed. According to Green, early scholarship on Buddhism's entrance into China from India maintained that the acceptance and widespread adoption of Buddhist meditative practices during the Eastern Han and Three Kingdoms period was largely due to the similarity between their meditative practices, specifically similarities in breath meditation. From the 1930s onward, this became the dominant view in the scholarly literature. Buddhist and native Chinese meditation were, in their essence, similar, and this largely explains the appeal of Buddhist meditation to the Chinese people. According to the dominant view, the Chinese were attracted to the meditation practices that were similar to their own, like breath meditation, and found other dissimilar practices unappealing. Green, however, rejects the dominant view and instead argues that Buddhist and pre-Buddhist Chinese meditation were significantly different, and these differences were actually highly valued by their Chinese audience. Green's methodology consists of consulting textual evidence in the form of the following primary sources. We'll see Green's methodology in action in the subsequent slides, but here's a first pass at how he uses textual evidence to support his argument. The top three are sources on Buddhist meditation instructions. And as you can see here, the top two are texts with the same name, but they are different copies. The first is the copy that was available to the previous scholarship that Green is reacting to. This turns out to be a later copy of the root text with commentary and alterations in terminology. The second is an earlier copy that was discovered in 1999 and appears to be the original root text. This copy is especially important for Green's argument. Sources 4 and 5 are Taoist texts containing instructions on pre-Buddhist Chinese meditation. Finally, source 6 is an Indian Buddhist text containing instructions on breath meditation. Now, turning to terminology, we look at some terms from pre-Buddhist Chinese meditation. First, nourishing life is a Taoist breathing exercise in which one concentrates on and visualizes the breath entering the body and nourishing the organs with qi. Second, the term that gets translated as breath, qi, can also mean vital energy or vital force. It is a concept in Chinese philosophy referring to the psychophysical energies that permeate the universe. Early Taoist philosophers and alchemists, who regard qi as a vital force inhering in the breath and bodily fluids, developed techniques to alter and control the movement of qi within the body. Their aim was to achieve physical longevity and spiritual power. Finally, guarding the one is another Taoist breathing exercise where the one refers to the deity purported to reside within the viscera. Here, the object was to guard or irrigate the deity inhabiting the organs with qi and thereby strengthen them and ensure long life. Concerning Buddhist terminology, contemplation on bodily impurity refers to a variety of Buddhist meditative practices involving contemplation of the impermanence of the body, breath, and indeed all phenomena. These practices involve graphic visualizations of the body in various stages of decay. When one is in the grip of attachment in the form of identification with the body, the practitioner is instructed to imagine one's own body as a decaying corpse, or imagine the individual parts of the body scattered about in different places. Alternatively, in case of craving for sensual desire, say lust, the practitioner is instructed to imagine the body of the person who is the object of the sexual desire as a corpse. The specific features of the person that occasion the desire are to be countered with visualizations of various aspects of a corpse. For instance, when one lusts after a woman's beautiful skin, one is instructed to visualize the bloated skin of a corpse. And when the meditator lusts after the beautiful red of a woman's lips, one is encouraged to imagine the deep red of blood flowing from a corpse. The instructions end, quote, "Everything is empty. It is but the workings of the mind," close quote. Turning now to the details of Green's argument and the evidence he provides for it, we'll look at three central problems with the dominant view. First, problems with textual evidence that previous scholars adduced for their conclusion. Second, problems regarding the differing nature and aims of the two sets of meditative practices. And third, the problem arising from the fact that the Chinese had access to alternative breath-based practices. So I've already mentioned one aspect related to this problem, which is that the Taoist and native Chinese terminology is absent in the early Kongaji copy of the Scripture on Mental Restraint, believed to be the original root text. Additionally, even in the later text where the pre-Buddhist terminology is present, their original meanings are subverted. That is, they are used in such a way that it is apparent that the translator is aware of their original meaning and is consciously using them to a different effect. Furthermore, in both copies, remarkably, breath meditation plays a decidedly subordinate role. Far more attention in the text is given to various forms of contemplation on bodily impurity. And as we will see, when breath meditation is described, it does not serve the same function as it does in native Chinese breathing exercises. Next, as we saw earlier, these pre-Buddhist forms of meditation native to China involved, at least in part, visualizing the breath nourishing the internal organs and the deity purported to inhabit them. The goal of these practices ultimately was to achieve immortality, or at least to increase the length of one's life. In the Buddhist meditation that became popular in China, however, the breath was used as an object lesson on impermanence and was not seen as having any therapeutic value. One passage that demonstrates this reads, quote, "In breath meditation, one directs the mind towards counting and does not think about the material aspect of the breath. When the breath is exhausted, there is extinction resulting in impermanence. To know impermanence is the way," close quote. Additionally, this same subsidiary role of the breath is described in the Scripture on the 12 Gates. Furthermore, the role of the breath was secondary to that of the body. Greater emphasis is placed on mindfulness of the body while breathing than breath per se. The aim of these practices was to cut attachments and cravings that keep one bound to the ongoing cycle of death and rebirth in order to achieve liberation or nirvana from this revolving door of existence. And this ultimately is why these Buddhist texts gave pride of place to practices like the contemplations on bodily impurity. Thus, to the extent that the Scripture on Mental Restraint focuses on the breath, it nevertheless plays a secondary and subordinate role. Finally, Green points out that the Chinese had, in fact, if the Chinese had, in fact, preferred a more familiar Buddhist meditative practice that shared more in common with their own native breathing practices, they could have had them, given that translations of Indian Buddhist texts with similar instructions were circulating throughout China at the same time as the Scripture on Mental Restraint. He maintains that there are striking similarities between the Indian and Chinese breathing exercises to be found in the Yogacara Bhumi Shastra. And he takes this to be strong evidence that the Chinese were not attracted to Buddhist meditative practices because they were similar to their own, as the dominant view maintains. Rather, they were attracted to them precisely because they were different. And this conclusion is supported by the fact that there were other similar breathing exercises on offer. So in conclusion, while building this negative case against the dominant view, Green provides a positive case for accepting his argument that missionaries bringing Buddhism into China were self-consciously portraying Buddhist meditation as the polar opposite or mirror image of indigenous Chinese practices. In describing this complicated relationship between these separate traditions of meditation, Green observes the influence that they had on each other. The Taoist scripture of the Yellow Court from the early 4th century described body-based practices that were quite similar to those described in the scripture on mental restraint, and they had also begun to practice meditation in a seated posture rather than lying down. Conversely, Buddhist meditation had begun to adopt breathing exercises that were practiced for the sake of improved health. And by the late 6th century, meditation had become an umbrella term to refer to all of these practices. Perhaps the dynamic or syncretic relationship that evolved from the time of Buddhism, from the time that Buddhism entered China, did play a role in the previous scholars' failure to see the deep differences between these forms of meditation. At any rate, these previous scholars were in part misled by their late copy of the scripture on mental restraint. So regarding my thoughts or criticisms, Green presents a thorough and convincing argument with separate lines of evidence and plausible explanations for what went wrong with the previous scholarship's interpretation and reasoning. However, I do have one criticism. The Indian Buddhist breathing meditation that he described does not seem comparable to Taoist breathing exercises. He cites the Yogacarī Bhuma Shastra breath meditation instructions, which state, quote, "The practitioner sits alone in a quiet place. He collects his mind and, closing his mouth, devotes himself to contemplating the inhalation and exhalation. He contemplates the breath as it passes from the nose into the throat, then down into the region of the navel, from where it returns back to the nose," close quote. I submit that this is really more akin to the Buddhist practice of mindfulness of the body while breathing than it is to the Taoist practice of guarding the one or nourishing life, because no emphasis is placed on the material aspect of the breath as a special and curative primary object of meditation. Like the kind of practice described in the scripture on mental restraint, the breath plays a somewhat arbitrary role as an object of concentration, and the focus seems to be more on the body. However, this only addresses the third problem that Green raises with the dominant view, and I think his other points are quite compelling and left unaffected by my criticism here. So here's my bibliography, and that's all I have for you, so thanks for listening.